Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Prison Officers Association, Britain's largest professional trade union for staff working in prisons and correctional centres, public and private mental health services trust providers, and immigration services, with nearly 35,000 members. A new survey on the extent of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, amongst prison staff was unveiled at the union's recent annual conference. Out of a survey size of 400, a frightening 51.7% were found to be exhibiting signs of PTSD. In this episode, report author and trainee forensic psychologist Laura Wright tells us more about the report's findings, what an appropriate response might look like, and how to know if you may be carrying the symptoms of PTSD. We start on that very point. How might a member know if they are suffering from PTSD?
So some of the, difficulties people would be looking for would be about replaying or revisiting an incident in some way. So this could come up as images that somebody experiences in their mind or kind of video playback. It might just be really, really strong emotion. But there'll be this sense of not just remembering something, but actually reliving an experience as though they've been transported back in time. That might also come up as nightmares. They will also experience what we call sort of hypervigilance, which is feeling really, really tense, alert, on edge a lot of the time. And they might see changes in their behavior as well. So things that they might, usually have felt safe doing, suddenly don't feel safe anymore. They change the way they carry themselves, avoid certain situations. They might turn up a TV program about prisons. Maybe it reminds them of something, that happened in their real life. And what we see is quite key in terms of what turns something into a sort of PTSD reaction, I suppose, is not explicitly about what happened, but often the meaning that somebody attaches to it. So it could be witnessing something happened to somebody else. It could be a near miss incident. It could be something where someone's come out completely unscathed, but perhaps they felt guilty in some way about their actions, or they questioned if it was their fault. They felt that somebody else put them in danger, or they were worried about how they responded. A lot of people might have an idea of how they think they'll respond in a dangerous situation. And when that doesn't match up, they maybe feel like they can't trust their own reactions anymore. So we see that meaning actually is often really key, rather than it just being about what happened. It could be what could have happened as well.
And this really is a quite a deeply entrenched and widespread problem for prison officers, isn't it? Because your research had a sample size of, I think, 400 prison officers, and you found that over 50% were exhibiting some signs of PTSD. So it's clearly a timely and important piece of research, but I wonder, where did the idea come from? And what attracted you first to looking in more detail at PTSD or the prison service, or both?
So I think it's been a mixture of my own clinical experience, but also then seeing actually how under-researched this area is within the UK prison officer population. So I've worked myself in forensic settings for sort of just under 10 years and spent about 7 years working in prison. And I think I was really struck going into the first prisons that I worked in around how much of what goes on behind the walls isn't really seen in the public, and that impact isn't really seen. And when I started my training qualification, I've sort of become more involved in staff support as part of that as well. And I've always been quite interested in burnout more generally and how that impacts staff, but also many organisations in recent years have worked towards bringing in trauma-informed care. But in my experience, staff trauma was sometimes missing from those conversations. And actually a really important part of trauma-informed care working is those two things going hand in hand, that we're thinking about the clients or prisoners or patients, whoever we're working with, their trauma, but also that staff trauma is thought about, because they're the saying that, you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think both sides of that need to be thought about. when it came to starting to formulate the idea for the research projects and doing a bit of searching online to try and find out, what was already out there, I found most of the studies were coming from the US. Those that were in the UK tended to be perhaps smaller studies, or they focused on specific issues. But there was an older study that was around experience of self-inflicted death in custody and for staff dealing with that. But there wasn't anything kind of more broad that looked at the different factors, or even just getting that estimate of the prevalence rate for prison officers in the UK.
Gosh, so a real gap, as it were, in knowledge and understanding about what is clearly a very important and serious issue. And what were the kind of headline findings from your research about the prevalence of PTSD amongst the prison staff population?
First of all, there was that percentage, the sort of 51.7% that we found had sort of clinically significant symptoms. And we say clinically significant, I guess, because we haven't been able to do kind of individual mental health assessment there. We can't diagnose all of these people with PTSD, but where we use the questionnaire tools to kind of measure symptoms there, we're seeing that actually there's a level of symptoms that are high enough there that these people who we feel in distress probably impacting their everyday life. So that's just why we use that term, sort of clinically significant there. And whilst it's a high level, I suppose in part I want to say it maybe isn't completely surprising. We also have to perhaps be a little bit mindful of kind of bias whenever we do an online survey. I imagine that, people sort of seeing the survey advertised, if they didn't think they had PTSD, they probably were going to kind of pass that by. But it does still tell us something important. We looked at other factors alongside just those symptoms about how officers are experiencing their workplace. So that could be to do with relationship with colleagues, feeling valued by management, feeling like they have the equipment and resources to do their jobs properly. And we found that was also quite linked to that experience of the trauma symptoms there. So generally, the more frustrated a staff member reported being with their workplace, the more likely they were to show a sort of higher level of symptoms there than other groups. We also looked at different demographic factors, so gender, age of staff, grades and roles that they're working in, and the different work locations. And that was perhaps where some of the other kind of interesting results came out, in that there wasn't any difference in across sort of male or female staff. So they both would, experience sort of similar levels of symptoms there. And we didn't see any difference, or any what we call a kind of statistically significant difference, where we can say there's a pattern showing up in times that it's probably not by chance, it's probably not random. But that, wasn't there when we broke it down by sort of grade or where kind of category prison that the staff worked in. And that I felt was quite key, because I wondered if, perhaps this is something that we might think it's only going to affect staff who are working in high security, or it might only affect staff who work in the segregation unit, perhaps who are exposed to, perhaps the more extreme violence, or so we might think. But actually we were seeing no real differences showing up there between those staff who might work in category A to those who could be working in an open prison. And I think that's really important to know, that impact can be spread across the board, and that actually no one group is more vulnerable than another.
Which is very alarming, really, because it means that the distribution of PTSD incidents is so widespread that in turn means that anyone, anywhere, any grade, any length of service, any category of prison has a chance of being caught by it, basically. It means it is a truly generic, universal problem within the prison service. I suppose the thing that is unique about prison officers is the extent of potential trauma they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And one of the consequences from that is an attempt to kind of normalize or digest or accommodate some extraordinary things that POA members have to deal with. Was that a particular issue for you as a researcher? Were there other particular standout issues that made this inquiry challenging or unique in some way?
Yeah, I think that normalization perhaps happening in different ways. I suppose it's about the kind of what people are being exposed to, that if you're seeing that all around you, that maybe that starts to normalize it, in the sense that when someone perhaps has an adverse reaction to an assault or a hostage situation, whatever it is they've been exposed to, I think perhaps because they might see, oh, well, so and so had that happen and they weren't affected by it, that what it then normalizes is that you shouldn't be
Yeah.
affected by, or maybe that, yeah, there's something wrong there. But I also felt that there maybe comes in as a bit of survival mechanism, and actually it means that staff might just say, well, this is just how it is. This is just how these things happen. You just have to get on and deal with it. And it meant then that actually those staff who were having symptoms of post-traumatic stress, that normalization maybe then extended into that reaction, that getting PTSD would just be a normal reaction to an incident there, rather than seeing it as a condition that is treatable and something that people can and do recover from.
In the verbatim quotes that you've included in the report, which bring the whole thing to life in a very vivid, frightening way, the kind of lack of agency, almost like the powerlessness that some people report feeling, is very noticeable. How does that feed into the actions that a responsible employer might want to think about taking to deal with a situation like this?
One of the biggest things I think I've made in terms of the recommendations, I think is perhaps most important, is around that cultural shift. I don't want to have a level of acceptance when we say it's okay for staff to go to work and become traumatized. I think it's the acceptance that they're in an environment where that risk of being exposed to trauma is probably never going to be zero. Even if we had the best prisons in the world, even if there were, no assaults, there would be a level of trauma exposure still there. The prisoners coming into prison with, the reading stories of people offending, those things would still be there, even if we managed to get rid of all the violence. So I think having that acceptance that that risk is there, and therefore bringing in more around how we prevent people becoming traumatized, that doesn't, that part doesn't have to happen. And that's to do with how we prepare people before they're exposed to something traumatizing. It's about them feeling able to deal with an incident during, when it's there, when they're facing it, and then about how we're responding to that afterwards. And that all of that comes into how we bring about education and awareness of sort of common reaction to trauma, so people can really actually recognize the symptoms of PTSD there, because many of the staff I spoke to weren't even aware that that might be what they were going through. Knowing that, as I say, that it's treatable, I think that was something that's quite concerning and disappointing, maybe, that people felt that terminal or there's a life sentence there of having these symptoms when there are treatment interventions out there. And I think also what that cultural shift does is the kind of workplace support that's available. So things like the trim programs or mental health allies. I mentioned a bit in the report about how actually we might want to see some more evaluation of those programs, having figures there that say, what's working or what the barriers are, because that will make people feel more confident to actually use those services. But also then perhaps changes that attitude for the staff that are either attending a debriefing or even those that are delivering it, that they realise that actually the reason these things are there is to help prevent PTSD or to prevent, that impacting someone's mental health. They can end up being, I think, because when there's so many different interventions and procedures that people have to follow around an incident, it can just feel like, oh, this is another one of those tick box exercises. And maybe then people either don't prioritize it, oh, it's just, it's just another debriefing that I'm going to have to go to. It's not really a big deal. And that the people delivering it as well realize that you've got a big responsibility there. Make sure that the people who need to be at a debriefing are there. Make sure it's delivered how it's meant to be delivered, because all of those things actually are a really important part of what we understand helps to prevent someone's trauma turning into PTSD. But perhaps there might not always be that recognition when it just becomes another task that people have to do.
You've said elsewhere that there's now a clearer understanding about what is happening in terms of PTSD, but not necessarily why it's happening. And that's the even bigger, more important part of the jigsaw, because until there's an understanding about why it's happening, preventative strategies won't be as effective as they might be. I suppose if there's an understanding of why, you're shutting the stable door before the horse has bolted rather than afterwards. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the results we sort of found, or particularly the prevalence rate, I suppose, was then it's obvious in a way. We've seen in the news recently the level of violence that prison staff are having to deal with. So, breaking news, prison officers traumatized. Actually, what the research helps us start to do there is get to the root of why that is. So something that we found during the study was that actually the age of prison officers was something that was relevant to that experience of PTSD symptoms. So we found that staff who were older generally had a slightly lower level of symptomology than younger staff. Now, part of, as I'm kind of writing up and still kind of finding new patterns within the data, is trying to pick out exactly why that is. Is it that we think our older staff then, are they becoming more desensitized? We haven't measured that. We can't say that. But we also know that in the general population, as we get older, people tend to have slightly higher self-esteem. And we found that self-esteem and resilience, particularly, were two factors there that protected staff more generally against that effect of PTSD. So we don't know, is it that those older staff have higher levels of self-esteem and resilience, and that's what's protecting them? They might still be being exposed to the same level of incident, but actually what might it be that's there for them that helps them to cope a little bit better would be something we want to explore more as well. So that's where that research is really important, to just help us build that evidence, understand all these different factors and how they interlink.
One of the standout things from your report, in my reading of it, is the use of verbatim contributions from prison officers who participated in the survey. Is there a particular quote that particularly sums up the issues or gives a particular insight into the challenges facing prison officers on PTSD?
So I think there were certainly a couple of staff that I spoke to who actually talked to our experience in their own suicidal thoughts, or also about colleagues who had gone on to take their own lives because of the stress or distress they were going through. So I think it was that real stark truth there, that actually perhaps there's this bit of a culture that, that you have a laugh and call each other fraggles. But then there's this really serious point where one staff member in particular, talks about actually getting to the point of thinking he was going to take his own life and only being stopped by thinking about his son. And I think that in particular, this sense of, that hopelessness for people where, that doesn't have to be the case, that, the support is there and it can work. And I don't think we ever want staff to feel like they've got to that point.
No.
When they talk to their colleagues or their families or anyone about what they're going through.
So what happens next? There's the process of continuing to build the evidence, but in terms of your recommendations, do they go to HMPPS, or have HMPPS already seen them and given an indication about what may happen in response?
Yeah, so I've had some initial conversations with those that are involved in policy within HMPPS and also within the Scottish Prison Service as well. So we're still kind of in early days, but there's some initial conversations there. I'm currently preparing to submit the research paper also to an academic journal, just to get that more out there in those sort of wider audiences as well. That's something I'd really like to take forward more broadly, because there's a lot more research out there around PTSD within the UK Armed Forces, and there's research studies going back 20 years with current and ex-armed forces personnel. The NHS has specific pathways for veteran services. There's research centres for trauma and policing as well. So I think I'd like to see not only that interest from the organisations and people on the ground, but also on that academic scale, and getting that interest, encouraging other academics to pick up research in this area as well, because the more we know, the better services we can offer there, the better prepared we are for the supporting staff.
Thank you so much for spending time explaining and shedding some light on the nuts and bolts of the research, and on conducting the research to start with, because it really does feel like this could well be the beginning of the end of an epidemic of PTSD in our prisons. So, Laura, thank you very much. My thanks to Laura Wright. If you want to read a summary of the recommendations or study the full report, it is available on the Union's website, and the link is published in the show notes to this episode. Also available in those notes are links to organisations that can provide advice and guidance on PTSD. If you have any doubts at all about your health and well-being, please do get it checked out. Thanks for listening. We hope you have found what you have heard to be interesting and helpful, and that you will join us for the next episode of the POA podcast. Thank you and goodbye.